The Hashashin. In 1092, inside the heavily guarded court of the Seljuk Empire in Isfahan, a vizier named Nizam al-Mulk was traveling under armed escort when a man disguised as a wandering mystic approached him with a petition. Moments later, the vizier lay bleeding from a dagger wound to the chest. The assassin did not attempt to flee. He stood still, surrounded by soldiers, and was cut down instantly. But the damage had already been done. The most powerful political figure in the empire had been eliminated in broad daylight by a man who expected to die. What investigators uncovered afterward would unsettle rulers from Persia to Europe. This was not random violence. It was an execution ordered by a hidden brotherhood operating from a mountain fortress no army could breach. The organization was known as the Hashashin. Centered in the Alamut fortress high in the mountains of northern Persia, nearly 6,500 feet above sea level, the order was founded by Hassan-i-Saba, a scholar-turned-revolutionary strategist. Unlike conventional armies, the Hashashin did not rely on numbers. They relied on precision. Recruits were carefully selected, often trained from youth, educated in languages, theology, espionage, and combat. They were taught patience above all else. A mission could take years to prepare. Targets were studied, routines memorized, guards mapped, escape routes irrelevant. Their weapon of choice was the dagger, not poison from a distance, not arrows from rooftops. The Hashashin preferred proximity. They infiltrated cities disguised as merchants, servants, monks, or scholars. They embedded themselves inside courts and military circles. When the moment came, they struck at the heart of power, often in front of witnesses. The message was deliberate. No fortress was secure. No king was unreachable. No armor was thick enough. European crusaders encountered stories of the order during campaigns in the Levant. Accounts described assassins slipping into tents at night, leaving daggers pinned beside sleeping commanders as warnings. Some reports claimed that certain leaders awoke to find a blade planted inches from their pillow, proof that their lives had been spared temporarily. Whether every detail is accurate remains debated, but contemporary chronicles agree on one point. Rulers feared them more than armies. The fortress of Alamut itself was engineered for isolation. Built on a narrow ridge, surrounded by steep cliffs, it could store years of provisions. Wells carved into rock ensured water supply. Attempts to storm it failed repeatedly. Intelligence networks radiated outward from the mountain stronghold, connecting cells across Persia and Syria. Messages traveled silently through coded scripts and trusted couriers. Yet what truly distinguished the Hashashin was psychological warfare. They did not need to kill everyone. They needed rulers to believe they could. When political leaders began sleeping with guards inside their chambers, when alliances shifted out of fear rather than diplomacy, the order achieved influence without occupying territory. Eventually, in 1256, the Mongol armies besieged Alamut. The fortress fell after prolonged resistance. Officially, the order was dismantled. Records were burned, structures destroyed, surviving members scattered. But long after the stones of Alamut were reduced to rubble, the legend endured. The idea that a small, disciplined network could destabilize empires from within became embedded in history. If a group operating from a mountain fortress could manipulate kings through targeted elimination, then power itself may be more fragile than it appears. Because if one assassin can reach a vizier in broad daylight, then the question is not whether rulers are protected. The question is how long that protection truly lasts. The Sicarii. In 66 AD, during the volatile years of Roman occupation in Judea, Jerusalem was already a city balanced on the edge of revolt. Roman soldiers patrolled the streets. Collaborators whispered in marketplaces. Priests argued in temple courts. And somewhere within the crowds, men with concealed blades waited for the right moment. One afternoon, as thousands gathered for a religious festival inside the temple complex, a respected Jewish aristocrat collapsed to the ground, blood spreading beneath his robes. Witnesses saw nothing. There had been no shouting, no struggle. The killer had already vanished into the crowd. This was not an isolated act. It was part of a coordinated terror campaign, carried out by a shadow faction known as the Sicarii. The Sicarii took their name from the Sika, a short, curved dagger easily hidden beneath loose garments. Unlike open rebels who confronted Rome directly, the Sicarii weaponized anonymity. They operated within dense gatherings, selecting targets who were viewed as collaborators or political threats. The strike was surgical. The assassin would press close, drive the blade upward beneath the ribs, and withdraw before the victim even realized what had happened. In the chaos that followed, screams and confusion masked the escape. Contemporary historian Josephus described how panic spread through Jerusalem not because of the number of killings, but because of the unpredictability. No official could identify the assassins. No guard could prevent infiltration. The Sicarii did not wear uniforms or symbols. They were indistinguishable from the very citizens they walked beside. That was their advantage. They did not conquer territory. They destabilized trust. Their operations extended beyond Jerusalem. Records suggest that they infiltrated rural settlements, burned estates belonging to pro-Roman elites, and executed entire households believed to be cooperating with occupying forces. One particularly chilling episode occurred at the fortress of Masada. After Roman forces besieged the stronghold, hundreds of Sicarii and their families chose mass suicide rather than surrender. The story became legend. But what often goes overlooked is the psychological footprint they left behind before that final act. Roman administrators found themselves unable to separate ally from enemy. Informants were executed. Local leadership fractured. Rumors spread that the Sicarii had infiltrated temple clergy, merchant guilds, even households of prominent families. The blade could appear anywhere, and because the assassins expected death, traditional deterrence failed. Arrests did little. Executions did not stop recruitment. Military crackdowns intensified. Entire neighborhoods were searched. Public punishments became spectacles meant to deter sympathizers. Yet the killings continued intermittently. The Sicarii did not require large numbers to function. They required uncertainty. Every crowded gathering became a potential execution ground. Every handshake concealed suspicion. Eventually, the Roman response escalated into full-scale war. Jerusalem was besieged in 70 AD. The temple was destroyed. Survivors were scattered or enslaved. Officially, the Sicarii vanished in the aftermath. But their operational model endured, a small network embedded inside civilian populations. Targeted killings designed not merely to remove opponents, but to fracture societies. They demonstrated that an empire can occupy land, but it cannot fully occupy the mind of a population living in fear. Because once a city begins to suspect that the man standing beside you could be an executioner, power no longer resides in armies. It resides in the unseen hand gripping a concealed blade. The Iga Clan. In 1581, under a sky thick with smoke and drifting ash, the mountainous province of Iga in feudal Japan was invaded by the forces of warlord Oda Nobunaga. His army numbered more than 40,000 men. Their objective was clear: eradicate a network of shadow operatives who had embarrassed powerful daimyo for decades. Nobunaga understood something many rulers eventually discovered too late. The ninja of Iga were not soldiers in the conventional sense. They were infiltrators, saboteurs, professional assassins who could enter a fortified castle at night and leave before dawn with a life extinguished and no witnesses. The Iga clans operated within a terrain of steep valleys and narrow passes, roughly 1,500 feet above sea level, surrounded by dense forest and natural barriers. Geography itself served as protection. Villages functioned as both civilian communities and training grounds. From childhood, recruits were educated not only in martial arts, but in stealth movement, lock-picking, disguise, herbal toxins, and information gathering. Combat was only one component. Silence was the true discipline. Unlike open battlefield warriors bound by Bushido codes, Iga operatives specialized in asymmetry. They studied castle layouts, guard rotations, supply routes, and architectural weaknesses. Some missions required months of preparation. A servant might be planted inside a rival household. A traveling monk could gather intelligence under the guise of prayer. Even entertainers were used as access points. Once embedded, communication moved through coded symbols and concealed messages hidden inside ordinary objects. Their tools reflected their methodology. Collapsible ladders allowed scaling of stone walls exceeding 30 feet in height. Lightweight grappling hooks were engineered to anchor silently. Concealed blades were designed for close-range precision. powder mixtures created smokescreens in confined corridors. Poisons derived from plants were applied in minute quantities, causing delayed symptoms that resembled natural illness. The objective was not spectacle, it was deniability. Historical accounts describe daimyo waking to discover a message pinned inside their chambers. In some cases, a rival was found dead in a locked room, with no sign of forced entry. These incidents amplified the mythos surrounding the Iga clans. Fear spread beyond their actual numbers. Some lords began reinforcing ceilings as well as doors, uncertain whether danger would descend from above or rise from below. When Nobunaga launched his invasion, the assault was brutal. Villages were burned, thousands were killed or displaced. Official records suggest the ninja threat was crushed, yet the destruction of Iga did not eliminate the skill set. Survivors were absorbed into other domains, particularly under Tokugawa Ieyasu, who later unified Japan. Former Iga operatives transitioned into intelligence networks serving the shogunate. Their methods did not vanish, they evolved. The Iga clans demonstrated that control of territory is secondary to control of access. Castles built of stone and timber could be bypassed by individuals trained to think beyond walls. Their greatest weapon was not the blade, but unpredictability. A ruler could command thousands of samurai, yet remain vulnerable to a single operative who understood every weakness in his routine. Because when protection is built outward, but the threat moves inward, strength becomes an illusion. And in the quiet corridors of a fortress, the softest footsteps often carry the deadliest intent. The Koga Clan. In 1615, as the Tokugawa shogunate tightened its grip over a fractured Japan, a senior advisor within Osaka Castle reportedly fell ill after attending a private strategy meeting. He had shown no symptoms earlier that morning. By nightfall, his speech had slowed, his breathing became shallow, and within hours he was dead. Physicians attributed the cause to sudden internal failure. There were no wounds, no sign of forced entry, yet whispers circulated among rival clans. The death had been arranged, not by open confrontation, but by operatives trained in the neighboring province of Koga. The Koga assassins emerged alongside their Iga counterparts, but developed a distinct operational culture. While Iga was known for mountain isolation and defensive resilience, Koga specialized in fluid integration into shifting political landscapes. Their villages were less fortress-like, more interconnected with trade routes and surrounding domains. This proximity allowed for greater access to merchant networks, itinerant monks, artisans, and bureaucrats. In effect, Koga operatives could move through feudal Japan without drawing suspicion. Training emphasized adaptability over spectacle. Recruits studied social behavior as intensely as weaponry. They learned regional dialects, class etiquette, and the subtle rituals of court life. Disguise was not limited to clothing. It extended to posture, accent, and knowledge of local customs. A Koga operative embedded inside a castle might function as a stable hand, cook, clerk, or low-ranking retainer for years before executing a mission. Their preferred methods reflected this patience. Instead of dramatic close-range attacks, Koga operatives often relied on incremental destabilization. Poisoning was refined into an art form. Extracts derived from aconite and other toxic plants were administered in doses measured in grains, inducing symptoms that mimicked natural disease. Supply sabotage was another tactic. A single contaminated well or food store could weaken a garrison without a single blade drawn. Historical documents from the late Sengoku period describe unexplained fires erupting in strategic storehouses days before rival forces advanced. Bridges collapsed under suspicious circumstances. Messengers disappeared along predictable routes. Though direct attribution remains scarce, patterns align with the operational signature associated with Koga agents. Unlike the mythologized image of black-clad figures leaping across rooftops, Koga's influence was often invisible. They blurred the line between intelligence gathering and assassination. Information itself became a weapon. A forged letter could trigger internal conflict within a rival clan. A rumor seeded carefully could provoke purges that eliminated enemies without external intervention. As the Tokugawa regime consolidated power, many Koga operatives were formally absorbed into official intelligence units. Their methods were institutionalized. Surveillance systems expanded. Communication channels were monitored. Political loyalty was enforced not only by armies, but by unseen observers trained in deception. Over time, the overt identity of Koga as a distinct assassination order faded into bureaucratic structures. Yet their operational philosophy persisted. Control through infiltration, elimination through indirection, victory achieved without visible confrontation. What made the Koga assassins particularly unsettling was not the efficiency of their killings, but the erosion of certainty they produced. If a rival could be weakened by invisible hands months before a battle even began, then war itself became secondary to manipulation. Because the most dangerous enemy is not the one charging at the gate. It is the one already inside the walls, rewriting the outcome before the conflict even starts. The Thuggee. In 1830, along a dusty trade route stretching across central India, a merchant caravan of nearly 40 men vanished without a trace. There were no signs of struggle, no bodies left behind, no stolen animals found wandering the road. Weeks later, British authorities investigating a pattern of disappearances uncovered shallow graves hidden beneath scrubland less than 2 miles from the main route. The corpses showed no sword wounds, no gunshots. Instead, each victim bore a deep ligature mark across the throat. The killings had been silent, coordinated, ritualized. The perpetrators were identified not as random bandits, but as members of an organized network known as the Thuggee. The Thuggee Brotherhood operated for generations across northern and central India, embedding themselves into the flow of pilgrimage routes and commercial travel corridors. Unlike common highway robbers who attacked with overt violence, the Thuggee relied on deception and gradual trust building. Operatives would join caravans as fellow travelers, sometimes accompanying their targets for days or even weeks. They shared meals, stories, and religious rituals. They posed as traders, soldiers, priests, or simple wanderers seeking safety in numbers. The method of execution was consistent. At a prearranged signal, often a coded phrase or gesture, one assassin would distract the victim while another slipped a rumel, a length of cloth sometimes reinforced with a coin or knot, around the neck from behind. The garrote was pulled tight in a precise motion, designed to sever the carotid flow without excessive struggle. The victim collapsed within seconds. Bodies were then transported to concealed burial pits prepared in advance. The process was systematic, practiced, and disturbingly efficient. British colonial records from the early 19th century describe elaborate hierarchies within the Brotherhood. Leaders coordinated routes, scouts identified profitable targets, gravediggers prepared sites before the caravan even arrived. Signals were standardized. Each role was defined. The killings were not impulsive acts of violence, but components of a structured enterprise. What unsettled investigators most was the scale. Interrogations conducted during the suppression campaign, led by Captain William Sleeman, suggested that thousands of travelers may have been murdered over decades. While exact figures remain debated, the operational footprint spanned hundreds of miles. Entire stretches of road developed reputations for quiet disappearances. Religious dimensions added further complexity. Some accounts suggest the Thuggee framed their actions within ritual devotion, believing the killings fulfilled a divine mandate. Whether this belief was universal among members remains unclear. However, ritualized burial procedures and ceremonial gestures were documented repeatedly, reinforcing the perception of an organized order rather than scattered criminals. The British response escalated into a coordinated crackdown. Informants were recruited. Networks were mapped. Thousands were arrested or executed. By the mid-19th century, official declarations announced the eradication of the Brotherhood. Trade routes stabilized. Caravan traffic resumed with fewer reports of mass disappearance. Yet the psychological imprint endured. Travelers no longer feared open ambush alone. They feared companionship. The possibility that the man sharing a fire at night might tighten a cloth around your throat before dawn introduced a deeper anxiety than visible banditry ever could. The Thuggee demonstrated that assassination need not target kings to destabilize a region. By eliminating civilians systematically and invisibly, they disrupted commerce, trust, and the very concept of safe passage. Because when danger smiles, eats beside you, and waits patiently for a signal only it understands, survival becomes a matter of chance rather than strength. The Ottoman Executioners, In 1622, inside the labyrinthine corridors of Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, Sultan Osman II was deposed by a violent uprising of Janissaries. Within hours, the young ruler was taken into custody. He was not executed publicly. There was no trial, no formal proclamation. Instead, he was delivered to a secluded chamber deep within the palace complex. What happened next was carried out in silence. The men assigned to the task did not speak. They did not shout commands. They were chosen precisely because they could not. They were the Ottoman mute executioners, an internal corps trained to eliminate members of the ruling elite without spectacle or noise. Unlike battlefield units or conventional guards, the mute executioners functioned exclusively within the inner structure of imperial authority. Many were deaf and mute by birth. Their inability to communicate verbally was considered an asset. It reduced the risk of secrets leaking beyond palace walls. They were trained in restraint techniques, silent coordination, and the use of silk bowstrings designed specifically for strangulation. Bloodshed was avoided whenever possible. The objective was control, not chaos. The execution protocol followed a rigid structure. When a prince, vizier, or high-ranking official was marked for elimination, the order was transmitted discreetly through the palace hierarchy. The target was summoned under administrative pretense. Once inside a secured chamber, escape routes were sealed. The mute executioners entered in coordinated formation. The silk cord was looped around the neck, tightened from behind with calculated force. Death was swift, often within minutes, leaving minimal physical evidence beyond the ligature mark. Ottoman law traditionally prohibited the spilling of royal blood. This restriction reinforced strangulation as the preferred method for executing members of the dynasty. Princes confined within the cafes, a gilded yet restrictive section of the palace, lived under constant awareness that succession disputes could result in silent removal at any moment. Brothers eliminated brothers. Sons were removed to prevent rival claims. Power shifted not through public rebellion alone, but through controlled internal erasure. Foreign diplomats stationed in Constantinople recorded rumors of bodies carried discreetly through side corridors at night. Official explanations cited illness or sudden natural causes. Yet, patterns emerged. A rival disappeared shortly after expressing dissent. A reform-minded official was found lifeless days after challenging military authority. There were no dramatic trials, no open executions in city squares. The empire maintained an image of order while conducting lethal purges within its own walls. As centuries passed, the structured use of palace executioners diminished, particularly during periods of reform. However, the operational philosophy remained embedded in imperial governance. Elimination without public disruption preserved stability. Silence itself became a tool of statecraft. The existence of the mute executioners highlights a stark reality about centralized power. Protection and threat often reside within the same structure. The guards assigned to safeguard the ruler could just as easily become instruments of removal when political tides shifted. In an empire spanning 3 continents and commanding millions, the most decisive acts of succession sometimes unfolded in rooms no larger than 15 feet across, behind doors no citizen would ever see. Because when authority depends on secrecy, the quietest footsteps inside the palace may carry the weight of empire. The Praetorian Guard. In 41 AD, inside the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill in Rome, Emperor Caligula was walking through a private corridor lined with marble columns when members of his own guard surrounded him. The Praetorian Guard had been established as an elite protective force, sworn to defend the emperor at all costs. That afternoon, they did the opposite. Within moments, Caligula was stabbed repeatedly, collapsing onto the stone floor beneath statues of the very gods he claimed to embody. His wife and child were killed shortly after. The assassination was not the act of a lone conspirator. It was orchestrated by the very unit tasked with imperial security. The Praetorian Guard functioned as a hybrid between military corps and political instrument. Stationed in Rome rather than along distant frontiers, they possessed proximity to power unmatched by any legion. Their barracks, the Castra Praetoria, stood less than a mile from the center of imperial governance. Over time, their role expanded beyond protection. They became kingmakers, Unlike external assassin orders operating from mountains or hidden temples, the Praetorian eliminators worked within official authority. They wore armor sanctioned by the state. They escorted emperors during ceremonies. They controlled palace access. This structural integration gave them unparalleled leverage. When dissatisfaction grew toward an emperor, the guard did not require infiltration. They were already inside. Historical records reveal multiple instances of Praetorian intervention in succession. In 193 AD, after assassinating Emperor Pertinax, members of the guard reportedly auctioned the imperial throne to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus secured the position after promising substantial payment to each soldier. The transaction demonstrated that imperial authority could be transferred not through Senate decree or popular will, but through direct negotiation with armed elites. Their methods varied. Some removals were violent and public. Others were contained within palace chambers. Strangulation, stabbing, and coordinated ambushes occurred under the guise of internal disputes. The critical factor was timing. Eliminations were often synchronized with moments of political vulnerability, military defeat, fiscal crisis, or declining public support. The Senate held limited capacity to counterbalance the Guard's influence. Civilian officials depended on Praetorian loyalty for personal safety. Attempts to reform or disband the unit met resistance. Only after the rise of Constantine in the early 4th century was the Praetorian Guard formally dissolved, following a decisive military defeat. Their barracks were destroyed, and their institutional power ended. Yet the underlying dynamic remains instructive. The body tasked with defending supreme authority accumulated enough influence to determine who held that authority. Assassination became a mechanism not of rebellion from outside, but recalibration from within. For Roman citizens, stability appeared intact on the surface. Laws were issued, coins were minted, public games continued. But behind palace walls, the outcome of governance often hinged on the allegiance of a few thousand armed men stationed within walking distance of the emperor's bedchamber. The Praetorian eliminators revealed a fundamental vulnerability of centralized rule. When protection is monopolized by a single elite force, loyalty becomes transactional, and when loyalty can be purchased, power ceases to be permanent, because the closest shield to the throne may also be the sharpest blade pointed at it. The Persian Shadows. In 522 BC, during a period of upheaval within the Achaemenid Empire, a man claiming to be Bardia, brother of King Cambyses II, briefly seized the Persian throne. Within months, he was dead. Official inscriptions credit Darius I with exposing the impostor and restoring order. Yet certain accounts from Greek historians describe a quieter reality behind the palace walls. They speak of controlled access to royal chambers, of officials who vanished before formal announcements, and of deaths that left no visible wounds. Behind the monumental proclamations carved into stone may have operated a network less visible but equally decisive. Later traditions would refer to such operatives as the Shadow Blades. Unlike mountain-based orders or public military corps, the Shadow Blades were said to function within elite administrative circles. The Persian court was vast, extending across territories from Anatolia to the Indus Valley. Maintaining cohesion across thousands of miles required intelligence control as much as military strength. Courtiers, scribes, physicians, and attendants moved freely between provinces and palaces. Within this fluid environment, a small group of loyal enforcers could eliminate threats before they crystallized into rebellion. Their methods reportedly emphasized subtlety. Persian banquets were elaborate affairs, featuring layered courses and imported wines. A trace amount of toxin derived from regional plants could be introduced without altering taste or scent. Symptoms might not manifest until hours later, allowing death to be attributed to sudden illness. Court physicians, themselves bound by loyalty, would certify natural causes. No spectacle, no public alarm. Historical texts from Herodotus describe an environment where palace intrigue determined succession as often as open conflict. Royal relatives were closely monitored. Satraps governing distant territories could be recalled abruptly, only to fall ill shortly after returning to court. Written evidence is sparse, but patterns of unexplained mortality among political rivals suggest coordinated internal enforcement. The architectural design of Persian palaces further facilitated controlled isolation. Complexes such as Persepolis and Susa contained restricted inner quarters accessible only to select personnel. Corridors and audience halls were arranged to channel movement. Guards were stationed strategically, but authority within inner chambers rested with trusted attendants. In such an environment, removal required neither siege nor uprising. It required access. Unlike the Praetorian Guard, the Shadow Blades did not accumulate visible institutional power. They remained diffuse, embedded within bureaucracy rather than concentrated in barracks. Their anonymity was their defense. There were no uniforms distinguishing them from other officials, no fortress headquarters marking their domain. If they existed as a formal order, they were designed to leave minimal trace. Over centuries, as Persia transitioned through dynasties and invasions, documentation thinned. Conquests by Alexander and subsequent regimes reshaped administrative systems. Records were destroyed, translated, or rewritten. The notion of a dedicated assassination network became obscured beneath layers of imperial narrative. Yet the operational logic remains consistent with large empires facing internal volatility. When territory spans continents, suppression of rebellion cannot rely solely on armies marching across deserts. It requires preemptive removal of destabilizing figures before dissent gains momentum. The Persian Shadow Blades, whether formally named or not, represent a model of controlled elimination embedded within governance itself, a quiet recalibration of power conducted behind carved reliefs depicting eternal stability. Because when empires project images of unshakable order, the mechanisms preserving that order are often hidden from view, and sometimes the most decisive battles are won long before they reach the battlefield. The Byzantine Order. In 969 A.D., Emperor Nikephoros II Phocas was found dead inside his heavily fortified palace in Constantinople. His body lay on the marble floor of his private chamber, bearing multiple stab wounds. The official narrative blamed conspirators aligned with John Zimisces, who soon ascended to the throne. Yet, what troubled chroniclers was not only the murder itself, but how easily the assassins penetrated the most secure residence in the empire. The Byzantine palace complex was a maze of guarded corridors, iron-bound doors, and inner sanctums restricted to select individuals. No army stormed its gates that night. The killers moved quietly, deliberately, and without raising alarm. Later accounts would hint at an internal apparatus operating beneath the surface of imperial ceremony, a network historians now refer to as the Byzantine Silent Order. Byzantium was a state built on layers of intelligence, diplomacy, and religious authority. Unlike Rome's overt military dominance, Constantinople relied heavily on information control and court intrigue. Monasteries doubled as communication hubs. Court eunuchs managed access to the emperor. Bureaucrats oversaw intricate systems of taxation and surveillance. Within this structure, loyalty was monitored constantly. Yet, the same machinery that tracked dissent could be repurposed to remove it. The Silent Order was believed to consist of individuals embedded within palace administration and ecclesiastical institutions. Many were educated, multilingual, and versed in theological doctrine. Their proximity to both throne and altar allowed them to navigate political and spiritual spheres simultaneously. Assassination did not always require blades. Byzantine toxicology was advanced for its time. Compounds derived from arsenic and plant alkaloids were documented in medical treatises. Administered subtly in wine or food, such agents could induce gradual decline, creating the appearance of divine judgment or natural frailty. Records from the period describe rival patriarchs falling ill shortly after doctrinal disputes. Generals who returned victorious from frontier campaigns sometimes died unexpectedly before consolidating influence in the capital. While open conspiracies are documented, the consistency of certain deaths suggests a more systematic mechanism. Not every removal was violent. Some officials were reassigned to distant provinces where accidents or illnesses concluded their careers. Architecture facilitated containment. The Great Palace complex spanned multiple interconnected halls, courtyards, and chapels. Access was tiered. Only trusted attendants entered private quarters. In such an environment, coordinated elimination required internal cooperation rather than external force. Guards could be redirected, servants replaced. witnesses silenced before rumors reached the public forum. Byzantine chroniclers often framed sudden deaths as acts of divine providence. This narrative reinforced imperial legitimacy while obscuring human agency. The silent order, if formally organized, would have thrived within this ambiguity. Religion provided moral cover. Bureaucracy provided access. Secrecy provided protection. Over centuries, as the empire contracted and external threats mounted, documentation became fragmented. Crusader sackings, Ottoman conquest, and archival loss erased many internal records. What remains are patterns, recurring eliminations that stabilized succession during volatile periods, strategic deaths that prevented rival factions from mobilizing. The Byzantine Silent Order illustrates a refinement of political assassination woven into administrative fabric. Unlike battlefield slaughter or public execution, their operations preserved the facade of continuity. Power shifted with minimal spectacle. Stability was maintained not by absence of violence, but by its controlled invisibility. Because when authority intertwines with sanctity, the line between divine will and deliberate removal can disappear entirely. And within that blur, decisions of life and death are made without witness. The Mongol Hunters. In 1227, as Genghis Khan lay dying somewhere along the western frontier of his vast empire, rumors spread among rival leaders that the Mongol advance might finally slow. Some provincial rulers began to withhold tribute. Others fortified cities, believing distance would shield them. Within months, several of those same leaders were dead, not in open battle, not during siege. They were found executed inside compounds thought unreachable by steppe cavalry. The message was unmistakable. Even without the Great Khan present, the empire's reach extended farther than its armies. Behind the thunder of mounted divisions operated a quieter instrument of enforcement. Chroniclers would later describe specialized units tasked with hunting defectors across thousands of miles. They were not conventional soldiers, they were systematic pursuers, the Mongol death hunters. The Mongol military machine is often remembered for overwhelming force. Yet its intelligence network was equally formidable. Before major campaigns, scouts mapped terrain, supply chains, and leadership structures. Information traveled rapidly through relay stations spaced roughly 25 miles apart across the empire. This communication grid allowed commands to move with astonishing speed. Within that framework, targeted enforcement became possible. When a regional governor rebelled or a rival claimant emerged, a small detachment could be dispatched ahead of the main force. These units traveled light, sometimes numbering fewer than 50 riders. They relied on speed and local intelligence rather than brute strength. They studied travel patterns, merchant routes, and diplomatic envoys. Once a target's movement was identified, interception followed swiftly. Unlike siege warfare, which required months of preparation, these missions emphasized direct elimination. Historical Persian and Chinese sources describe sudden night incursions into fortified estates where guards were neutralized quietly before the intended victim was executed. In some cases, the body was displayed publicly at dawn as proof of imperial reach. In others, the death was disguised to avoid inciting broader unrest. Geography offered little protection. The Mongol Empire stretched from the Korean peninsula to Eastern Europe, covering over 9 million square miles at its height. Yet horse-based mobility combined with relay intelligence meant that distance was relative. A fleeing official might believe himself safe 1,000 miles from Karakoram, only to encounter riders who had tracked him through successive provinces. Psychological warfare amplified the effect. Stories circulated of individuals marked for death who attempted to hide in monasteries or distant courts, only to be discovered months later. Whether every account is accurate remains uncertain, but the consistency of such narratives reinforced compliance. Submission was preferable to pursuit. Unlike palace executioners or urban assassins, the death hunters operated across open terrain and foreign borders. Their presence blurred the line between military campaign and personal vendetta. Loyalty to the central authority was enforced not merely through taxation or occupation, but through demonstrable inevitability. As the Mongol Empire fragmented into khanates, centralized coordination weakened. Regional powers asserted independence, yet the legacy of targeted pursuit persisted. The idea that a state could project lethal precision across continental distances without formal battle altered strategic thinking for centuries. The Mongol death hunters reveal a distinct form of assassination embedded within imperial logistics. Power was not only the ability to conquer cities, it was the capacity to reach an individual anywhere within an immense territory. Because when an empire can cross deserts, mountains, and rivers faster than a rumor can travel, escape becomes theoretical. And the horizon offers no refuge from a rider who already knows where you are headed. The Venetian Circle. In 1355, beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Doge's palace in Venice, Marino Faliero, the sitting Doge, was executed for treason. Official records describe a failed coup and swift justice carried out by the Council of Ten. Yet behind the public narrative of conspiracy and punishment, Venice had already perfected a quieter system of eliminating threats long before blades were drawn in open court. For centuries, whispers circulated of a covert network embedded within the Republic's political machinery, a circle of specialists who dealt not in swords or garrots, but in powders and tinctures. Later, historians would refer to them as the Venetian Poison Circle. Venice was unlike other medieval powers. It was not ruled by a single monarch, but by a web of councils designed to balance authority. The Council of Ten, established in 1310, wielded extraordinary oversight powers in matters of state security. Operating behind closed doors, its members conducted secret trials, monitored correspondence, and received anonymous denunciations dropped into carved stone mailboxes scattered across the city. Within this climate of surveillance, the infrastructure for discreet elimination flourished. Venetian trade networks stretched from the eastern Mediterranean to northern Europe. With spices, silks, and exotic goods came knowledge of toxic substances. Apothecaries in the city stocked arsenic, belladonna, and compounds derived from imported plants. In small quantities, these substances could induce symptoms mimicking common illnesses of the era: fever, weakness, organ failure. A gradual decline rarely provoked suspicion, particularly when medical understanding remained limited. Several prominent deaths during the late medieval period followed patterns that raised questions. Political rivals of influential families succumbed after attending banquets. Diplomats negotiating unfavorable treaties fell ill upon returning from Venice. Merchants involved in trade disputes died unexpectedly, their estates redistributed with minimal resistance. While documented proof of organized poisoning remained scarce, the consistency of such outcomes aligned with the Republic's reputation for calculated statecraft. The architecture of Venice facilitated secrecy. Private chambers within palazzos connected to canals allowed discreet movement of individuals at night. Council proceedings were sealed. Records were archived in restricted vaults. Unlike monarchies where execution was often a public spectacle, Venice preferred invisibility. Stability depended on maintaining the image of rational governance. Open violence would undermine that image. Poison left no spectacle. Foreign envoys frequently remarked on the city's atmosphere of suspicion. Diplomatic letters described nobles who ate cautiously, sampling food in stages. Some rulers required trusted tasters, even for wine sent as gifts. Whether fear exceeded actual threat is difficult to measure, but fear itself became a tool. If rivals believed Venice capable of silent removal, the Republic gained leverage without deploying armies. By the 17th century, European courts widely associated Venice with sophisticated intrigue. The Poison Circle, whether formalized or loosely coordinated through state channels, symbolized a model of political assassination refined through commerce and bureaucracy rather than battlefield dominance. The Venetian case reveals a different evolution of lethal enforcement, not embedded in monasteries or mounted on horseback, but seated at council tables and banquet halls. Decisions made in quiet chambers could redirect trade routes, topple alliances, and secure dominance across the Adriatic. Because when a city built on water learns to erase opposition without a ripple, power flows not from open conquest, but from the unseen, drop dissolved into a glass raised in trust. The Crimson Brotherhood. In 1498, on the outskirts of Florence, a young nobleman was found lifeless in his private study just days before he was scheduled to inherit a powerful banking dynasty. There were no signs of forced entry, no weapon left behind. Servants claimed he had retired alone after an evening meeting with masked guests who arrived unannounced. The official cause of death was recorded as sudden cardiac failure, Yet, within weeks, rival interests secured control over his family's holdings. What unsettled observers was not merely the death, but the recurring detail whispered in private correspondence. Several witnesses had glimpsed a figure wearing a crimson half-mask departing the estate before dawn. Across late medieval Europe, fragments of similar reports appear in court chronicles and private letters. Sudden deaths of heirs, disappearances of claimants to thrones, quiet removals of influential advisors whose absence conveniently stabilized fragile alliances. In multiple cases, rumors referenced a clandestine fraternity known only by symbol rather than name. A red mask embossed with a narrow vertical line, the Crimson Brotherhood. Unlike the more documented orders of previous centuries, this group operated within the shifting political landscape of Renaissance courts. Europe at the time was a web of competing city-states, monarchies, and papal authority. Succession disputes were frequent. Marriage alliances determined territorial control. A single elimination could redirect entire dynasties. Within this environment, a discreet assassination network serving multiple patrons would wield extraordinary leverage. Accounts suggest the Brotherhood recruited from diverse backgrounds: former mercenaries trained in blade work, court performers skilled in disguise, physicians capable of administering measured toxins. Their operations adapted to context. In one region, a rival might die after falling from a balcony during a masked ball. In another, a carriage axle failed on a mountain road at precisely the wrong moment. Elsewhere, a sealed letter allegedly bearing incriminating evidence would surface just before a target vanished into imprisonment or exile. The defining feature was coordination. Patterns of destabilization, followed by rapid political consolidation, imply strategic timing rather than isolated vendettas. A claimant disappears. Within days, succession is resolved without civil war. A rebellious minister falls ill. Trade negotiations proceed uninterrupted. The absence of open conflict often benefited powerful institutions seeking continuity. Documentation is sparse, partly due to deliberate erasure. Private archives from several Italian families reference sealed investigations into foreign operatives influencing court affairs. Some manuscripts describe inquiries halted by higher authority. Others were reportedly confiscated by ecclesiastical officials. Whether these references point to a single organized brotherhood or loosely affiliated contractors remains uncertain. The symbolism of the Crimson Mask carries its own significance. Red associated with authority, martyrdom, and secrecy. A mask representing anonymity within spectacle. Renaissance courts were obsessed with theatrical display. Masquerades provided both entertainment and concealment. In such environments, blending into celebration while executing lethal intent would require exceptional discipline. By the 17th century, explicit references to the Brotherhood fade. Europe transitioned into more centralized state structures. Intelligence agencies formalized under monarchies. The need for semi-autonomous assassination fraternities diminished or transformed, yet the underlying model persisted. Political stability maintained through targeted elimination, conducted under layers of plausible deniability. Whether the Crimson Mask Brotherhood existed as a unified entity, or as a composite myth reflecting multiple covert operations, the recurring pattern remains consistent with the era's volatile power dynamics. Because when crowns change heads without armies clashing and fortunes shift without rebellion, the decisive act often occurs beyond the reach of public record. And sometimes, the only trace left behind is a glimpse of red in the shadows before the door quietly closes. Conclusion: these ancient assassin orders reveal a disturbing pattern. They were not random killers operating in chaos. They were structured, disciplined networks embedded within the very systems they appeared to serve. From the mountain fortress of the Hashashin to the palace corridors of Constantinople, from Roman guard barracks to Venetian council chambers, the method repeats. Power is destabilized not from outside walls, but from within them. This was not merely violence. It was precision. It was strategy. It was governance reshaped by elimination. Each order developed a specialized approach. Some used proximity and spectacle to instill fear. Others relied on silence and plausible illness. Some rode across continents to hunt defectors. Others waited patiently in banquet halls or monasteries. Different cultures, different centuries, the same underlying mechanism. What makes this pattern unsettling is its consistency. When rulers became inconvenient, they vanished. When succession threatened disorder, it was corrected quietly. When rebellion risked escalation, key figures were removed before armies mobilized. Assassination became an invisible instrument of political continuity. Official records rarely preserve the full story. Documents disappear. Chronicles frame events as divine judgment, natural causes, or unfortunate accidents. Yet, across civilizations separated by oceans and languages, the architecture of covert elimination emerges again and again. The question is not whether these groups existed. Many are historically documented. The deeper question is what they represent. If empires repeatedly relied on silent orders to regulate power, then stability may never have depended solely on law or loyalty. It may have depended on individuals trained to end lives without leaving history with clear fingerprints. Because the greatest threat to a throne is not always the army at its gates. Sometimes it is the quiet figure already standing in the room.